Hey everyone, this is a discussion, not a call out, not drama, just constructive conversation. Besides, I don't like drama. I prefer sci-fi. We're talking about a situation back in the fall that involved Tamias the Chipmunk and Phloppy Bunny. But more broadly, this is something a lot of creators likely struggle with. Uh, so, how do you protect yourself without pushing away the very audience your work depends on? Before I go any further, I want to make something very clear. I did make a mistake last fall. I accidentally trespassed into a private area in Second Life. Even though it wasn't intentional, I understand why that would be what concerns someone who owns or manages a virtual space. Looking back, I should have been more careful and paid closer attention to the rules and environment before interacting with things like teleporters. At the same time, there's important context here. I was completely new to Second Life at the time. I genuinely didn't understand how a lot of the systems worked yet. Groups, parcel permissions, teleporters, security systems, roleplay expectations, all of it. I was still learning the culture and mechanics of the platform. So, while I absolutely admit the mistake, I also think intent matters. This wasn't someone deliberately griefing a sim or trying to bypass security. It was a confused newcomer misunderstanding how the environment functioned. I had no ill will, neither did my fursona Juckrit, who is a gentle and peaceful shaman, who I admit is naive at times. And there's another detail that I think people outside virtual worlds may not immediately understand. At first, I honestly thought Floppy Bunny's hostility was partly in character roleplay. Second Life is full of avatars, personas, and roleplay environments. People often blur the line between performance and real identity. Um, so I initially interpreted his hostility as maybe it's part of his character, um, but I didn't immediately realize that his actual emotional tone was being directed at me as a real person. And when you're brand new to a virtual world, that distinction can genuinely be difficult to read. At first, I had trouble discerning whether people in Second Life were acting as characters or simply acting as themselves through avatars. That confusion probably delayed my understanding of how serious the situation had become. That said, I want to be transparent about my own perspective here. I'm not really a fan of blocking as a first response. I tend to value free speech and the free exchange of ideas, even when things are awkward or misunderstood. I think a lot of situations can be resolved, or at least clarified, through communication before jumping straight to cutting someone off completely. That doesn't mean blocking should never happen. There are definitely situations where it's necessary. Harassment, bad faith behavior, and repeated purposeful boundary violations. But when it's used preemptively or in response to a single misunderstanding, I think it can shut down conversations that might have otherwise led to understanding or even positive connection. Another important detail here is the timing. The incident and the blocks happened back in October, and even months later it was still on my mind. That says something about the impact. This wasn't just a quick, forgettable interaction. It stuck with me. Then in January I saw a journal post where Tamias mentioned that his dad had passed away. And that hit me in a very personal way because my own dad had just passed away just 2 weeks before his. Sorry. That's the kind of thing that under different circumstances could have been a point of genuine human connection. Not fandom, not platforms, just two people going through something very similar at nearly the same time. But because of how everything was handled earlier, that connection never had a chance to exist. And that's part of what makes situations like this feel heavier in hindsight. Not just what happened, but what could have happened. There's another part I feel strongly about, and I think it needs to be addressed directly. Part of the interaction involved comments from Floppy Bunny that came across as insulting or dismissive towards people on the autism spectrum. Now, I can't prove what he said exactly because I don't have the original transcript, So you just have my word here. I'm just being honest. I don't have the original transcript of what he said. Um, but honestly, that deserves criticism. I mentioned up front that I have Asperger's. For me, that means I sometimes misunderstand social systems, hidden expectations, or unclear interfaces, especially in a platform as complicated as Second Life. But here's the bigger issue. The furry community has a very large number of neurodivergent people in it. That includes many people on the autism spectrum. For a lot of autistic people, furry spaces are one of the few places where they've historically felt accepted, creative, and socially comfortable. So, when someone responds to an honest misunderstanding with ridicule or dismissiveness toward autism related traits, it sends a really unfortunate message that neurodivergent people are only welcome as long as they never inconvenience anyone. And that's not a healthy standard for a community that prides itself on inclusiveness. You don't have to tolerate harassment or repeated boundary violations, but there's a major difference between malicious behavior and someone genuinely struggling to interpret a situation correctly. Patience matters, especially in communities where neurodivergence is so common. I also want to add a perspective that might be a bit uncomfortable, but I think it's worth saying. From my point of view, the level of defensiveness around a virtual space can feel disproportionate at times. In a platform like Second Life, no one can actually steal your physical property. The risks are mostly about access control, disruption, or misuse, not permanent loss in real-world sense. I say that as someone who also maintains a virtual space, which is where I'm at right now, but my approach to security there is much more relaxed. At the same time, I have a real home I pay mortgage on. I have an actual security system. And I have 5 pets whose safety genuinely matters in a tangible, real-world way. So, when I compare those two things, real-world responsibility versus virtual world control, it changes how I personally prioritize risk and response. That doesn't mean virtual spaces don't matter. They absolutely do, especially emotionally and creatively. But it does raise the question of proportionality. How strongly should we react to mistakes in a space where the stakes, while real, are still fundamentally different from real-world harm? And this is where the tension comes in. When your income depends on people engaging with your work, trust becomes part of your business model, not just a personal preference. If someone runs an art business, especially in a community-driven space like the furry fandom, there's an implicit relationship with the audience. People discover your work, they observe before interacting, some of them eventually become clients, and that pipeline depends on accessibility and approachability. If the barrier to entry feels like one mistake and you're permanently blocked, then a lot of potential supporters won't even take the first step. Not because they're bad actors, but because they don't feel safe engaging. Now, don't take this the wrong way. I'm not saying that if he trusted people more, he wouldn't have these problems. That's a tempting idea, but it's probably incomplete. There are other possibilities. He may have had repeated negative experiences that led to stricter rules. He may be prioritizing personal safety and mental health over growth. Or he may prefer a smaller, highly controlled audience rather than a larger, unpredictable one. Those are all valid choices, but choices have trade-offs. What this does mean is, if you choose maximum control and strict filtering, you often get you may get fewer understandings and less stress, but there's also fewer new connections and opportunities. If you choose more openness, you may actually get more exposure and more potential clients, even if there might be some noise mistakes and occasional bad actors. Neither path is wrong, but trying to have both at the same time is where the friction happens. In the situation we talked about earlier, the response to a clear misunderstanding, followed by multi-platform blocking, fits a pattern of very low tolerance for uncertainty. That approach is consistent with strict boundary enforcement, but it also illustrates the downside. Someone who admired the work, shared niche interests, and might have been a long-term supporter was removed from the ecosystem entirely. Not because of malice, but because of a misread situation. And for co-owners or partners like Phloppy Bunny, there's an added layer. You're not just managing a space, you're also representing a brand. Even brief interactions shape how people perceive that brand. A single harsh response can outweigh dozens of neutral or positive impressions, especially for newcomers. And when that harshness includes comments that appear dismissive toward autistic traits, it risks alienating a significant part of the very community you're operating within. So here's the takeaway, not just for Tamias, but for anyone running a creative business online. Ask yourself, are your rules protecting you or isolating you? Are you filtering out bad actors or accidentally filtering out potential supporters? Is your communication style reducing confusion or escalating it? Are you creating room for neurodivergent people to make honest mistakes? Because in a community-driven spaces, clarity, patience, and tone are just as important as talent. At the end of the day, Tamias has every right to run his space and his business however he chooses, but it's also fair to say some of those choices may be limiting his ability to grow, connect, and maintain the kind of audience that a sustainable art career usually depends on. That's not an attack, it's just the reality of how social ecosystems work. And for anyone watching, this is a useful case study in balancing boundaries, communication, opportunity, and recognizing the human connections that sometimes get lost along the way. If you've ever struggled with where to draw that line between protecting yourself and staying open, you're definitely not alone. Thanks for listening. Like and subscribe.